When medieval chronicles talk about crusaders eating their enemies, most modern historians prefer to believe it's Muslim propaganda. But there's a problem with that comfortable theory. The crusaders themselves documented it. They didn't just admit it, some of them defended it. We're going to show you exactly what happened at the Siege of Antioch, how one of the most ambitious military campaigns of the Middle Ages turned into a nightmare of starvation and cannibalism, and why some men who survived this were never the same again. The story of cannibalism at Antioch begins with an impossible promise. In 1095, Pope Urban II gathered thousands at Clermont, France, and sold them a vision: reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim hands, earn eternal salvation, and by the way, gain riches beyond imagination. What he didn't tell them was that the road to the Holy Land crossed 3,000 kilometers of hostile territory, waterless deserts, and fortified cities that had resisted armies for centuries. He also didn't mention they would reach a point where they'd have to choose between starving to death or doing something that even the most brutal warriors of the age didn't consider human. But let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how men who swore to fight in Christ's name ended up roasting human flesh, you need to understand what kind of people answered Urban II's call. They weren't just pious nobles and honorable knights. The First Crusade attracted an explosive mix: landless second sons seeking property, desperate peasants escaping famines in Europe, adventurers thirsting for plunder, and religious fanatics convinced they were fulfilling divine will. Thousands left without adequate provisions, without geographical knowledge, without logistical plans. Some didn't even have proper weapons. The so-called People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, left first in 1096, a disorganized mob of 40,000 people, including women and children. They looted Jewish communities in the Rhineland, massacred civilians in Hungary, thinking they were already in Muslim territory, and were almost completely annihilated when they finally reached Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks destroyed them in a matter of hours, leaving piles of corpses so high that the bones were used to build a mountain of the dead as a warning. This massacre should have been a sign of what was coming. But the nobles leading the main crusade, men like Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Godfrey of Bouillon, weren't deterred. They left in 1096 with more organized armies, about 60,000 combatants and perhaps 40,000 non-combatants following them. They crossed the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Alexios I Komnenos looked at them with a mixture of relief and terror. He had asked for mercenaries to recover Anatolia, not an invasion of Western barbarians acting like they owned the place. He forced them to swear allegiance before crossing into Asia Minor, an oath most would break as soon as they had the chance. The first real objective was Nicaea, the Seljuk capital, which fell more through Byzantine diplomacy than Crusader assault. Then came the brutal march across Anatolia in the summer of 1097, where the desert sun killed more Crusaders than any battle. Men in full armor fainted from heat stroke. Horses died by the dozens each day. Water became more valuable than gold. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Turks nearly annihilated them with mounted archer tactics, retreating and shooting, turning the heavy European knights into slow, clumsy targets under the scorching heat. But they survived Dorylaeum, and in October 1097, they finally saw it: Antioch, one of Christianity's oldest cities, where followers of Jesus were first called Christians. Now it was in Muslim hands, ruled by Yaghi, a Turkish commander who had turned the city into a seemingly impregnable fortress. Antioch's walls stretched for kilometers, climbing steep mountains, with over 400 towers. The city had resisted Persian, Byzantine, and Arab armies. Yaghi had provisions for years. The Crusaders arrived with what they carried on their backs. And this is where Crusader arrogance crashed brutally into reality. They couldn't take Antioch by assault. The walls were too strong. They couldn't completely surround it. They didn't have enough men to seal such a large city. And they couldn't leave, because admitting defeat meant the entire crusade had been a bloody lie. So they did the only thing they could: camp outside and wait. They waited for 7 months. October 1097. The Crusaders set up camp. There was still food in the surrounding countryside, villages they could loot, supplies that occasionally arrived from the port of Saint-Simeon about 20 kilometers away. The nobles settled into relatively comfortable tents. Morale was high. They believed God would deliver the city to them. November. The first rains turned the camp into a muddy mess. Diseases began to spread. Dysentery, typhus, scurvy. The Crusaders started raiding farther and farther out, but Yagi Sian sent constant sorties from the city, attacking foraging parties. Dozens of Crusaders died each week, not in epic battles, but in miserable ambushes while searching for food. December. Winter hit hard. The mountains surrounding Antioch were covered in snow. Food became scarce. Horses started dying, not from combat, but from starvation. Without horses, knights were nothing. Men who had trained their entire lives to fight mounted now walked like peasants. Horse meat became a luxury. Rations drastically decreased. January 1098. The situation became critical. A Crusader chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, wrote that men were eating roots, seeds, herbs they'd never seen before. Some chewed boiled leather from their shoes and harnesses. The price of bread multiplied by 10, then by 20. The poor started dying first, collapsing in the camp mud, too weak to even ask for help. February. Reinforcements arrived, an army led by the Bishop of Le Puy. More mouths to feed, but also new hope. They attempted an assault. It failed completely. Antioch's walls remained impenetrable. But the worst wasn't the military failure. It was something more insidious. Despair was eating away at men's minds. Some began to desert, escaping at night. Peter the Hermit, the same man who had preached the crusade, tried to flee. They caught him and dragged him back. Even nobles considered leaving. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest commanders, finally took off with his troops, claiming illness. His wife never forgave him. March. Hunger was no longer just hunger. It was a constant, devouring pain that made men stop thinking rationally. The remaining horses were sacrificed and devoured within hours. Dogs, cats, rats, everything worked. There are records of men selling a single egg for absurd amounts of money. The social hierarchy began to collapse. Nobles fought over pieces of moldy bread. And then, in April, something changed. A group of crusaders found an abandoned Turkish camp near Aleppo. It was empty, except for one thing: corpses. Enemies killed in a recent skirmish. And someone, no one knows exactly who, suggested the unthinkable. The chronicles don't specify the exact moment, but the references start appearing. First they're vague, mentions of desperate acts and abominations that shamed even the pagans. Then they become more explicit. A group within the Crusader army began calling themselves the Tafurs. They weren't an official regiment, but a band of the poorest, most desperate, most maddened by hunger. Some say they were led by a Norman knight who had lost his mind. Others say it was just a mob of peasants without control. What is indisputable is this: the Tafurs began eating the dead. At first, only enemies. After skirmishes with Turkish sorties from Antioch, the Tafurs dragged bodies back to camp. Muslim chronicles mention it with horror. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote, "The Franks cooked adults in pots and roasted children on spits. You'd think it's propaganda, exaggeration from a frightened enemy. But here's the problem: the Crusaders themselves confirmed it." Radulf of Caen, a Crusader chronicler present at Antioch, wrote, "In Ma'ara, our soldiers boiled pagan adults in pots and stuck children on spits to roast them." Fulcher of Chartres, another Crusader chronicler, admitted, "Some cut pieces of flesh from the corpses because they were half dead from starvation." Albert of Aachen wrote that the Tafurs filled their stomachs with the flesh of Saracens. These aren't Muslim sources trying to demonize the enemy. These are Christians documenting their own atrocities. Why would they admit it? Because in the twisted mentality of some Crusaders, eating Muslim enemies wasn't just survival, it was psychological terror. The Tafurs wanted the Turks to know what they would do to them. They wanted the reputation to precede them. But here's the darker part that most histories leave out. They didn't stop with enemies. As the siege dragged on and hunger worsened, there's suggestive evidence, though less documented, that the Tafurs also consumed dead crusaders. When a man died in camp, his body disappeared quickly. The chronicles become deliberately vague about this because admitting cannibalism against the enemy was terrifying, but justifiable. Admitting cannibalism against fellow Christians was unforgivable. May 1098. Finally came the miracle the desperate crusaders needed, but it didn't come from God. It came from betrayal. An Armenian commander inside Antioch named Firuz, resentful because Yagisian had slept with his wife, agreed to hand over a tower to Bohemond in exchange for riches. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, Bohemond and a select group scaled the walls, killed the guards, and opened the gates. The Crusaders flooded Antioch like a wave of demented violence. The massacre lasted 2 days. They killed everyone they found: soldiers, civilians, Christians who had lived under Muslim rule for decades. The streets filled with blood, houses were looted, women raped, and yes, the Tafurs ate. The chronicles mention that some crusaders found warehouses full of food in the city, enough to feed everyone. But the Tafurs no longer ate out of necessity. Hunger had broken them in ways food could no longer fix. But Antioch's nightmare didn't end with the capture of the city. 3 days after taking it, a massive Muslim army led by Kerboga of Mosul arrived and besieged the besiegers. Now the Crusaders were trapped inside the same walls they had taken months to penetrate, surrounded by a fresh army, in a city they had already stripped of supplies. Hunger returned immediately, worse than before. For weeks, the Crusaders were on the edge of total collapse. They ate the remaining horses. They ate the saddles. They ate anything organic. Desertions increased. Some men lowered themselves down the walls at night, preferring to risk instant death at Muslim hands rather than slowly starve among Christians. Others simply surrendered, converting to Islam in exchange for food. And then another miracle occurred. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a vision of St. Andrew, who told him that the holy lance that pierced Christ's side was buried in the church of St. Peter in Antioch. They dug. They found a lance. Was it real? Probably not. Most historians believe Peter planted it there. Did it matter? Not at all. The Crusaders, maddened by hunger and desperation, believed God had given them a sign. On June 28, 1098, they emerged from Antioch in one last desperate charge. They had nothing to lose. They were starving, outnumbered, many could barely hold their weapons. But they charged directly at Kerboga's army with the holy lance carried at the front, and against all odds, they won. Kerboga, incredulous at the suicidal attack, thought it must be a trap. His emirs, jealous of each other, didn't coordinate their response. The Muslim army disintegrated. The Crusaders, driven by psychotic fury and religious fervor, pursued them for kilometers, killing thousands. They had survived Antioch. But the price was their humanity. The men who emerged from that siege weren't the same ones who had entered. They had crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. And the worst part is it wasn't over. Because after Antioch, the Crusaders marched south. And in December 1098, they arrived at Ma'ara. Ma'ara was a small city by comparison, about 20,000 inhabitants. The Crusaders besieged it for 2 weeks. When it fell, what followed was even worse than Antioch. This time, there was no excuse of extreme hunger. Food was available. But the Tafurs and other maddened Crusaders began killing and eating Ma'ara's inhabitants systematically. Radulf of Caen described it in horrible detail: adults boiled, children roasted. It wasn't just survival, it was revenge, it was madness. It was the result of months of trauma that had shattered any moral boundaries. The consequences of Ma'ara were so appalling that even the Crusader leaders were horrified. Raymond of Toulouse tried to stop the massacres. He failed. The cannibalism at Ma'ara became Muslim propaganda for centuries, and rightfully so. The Crusaders had confirmed every fear, every accusation of barbarity, and yet they continued toward Jerusalem. Now, let's talk about the psychological effects, because this wasn't just a case of do whatever's necessary to survive. The men who practiced cannibalism at Antioch and Ma'ara experienced something modern psychologists would immediately recognize: massive trauma combined with complete moral rupture. When they returned to Europe, many couldn't reintegrate. Some became hermits, others became violent monsters. The chronicles mention crusaders who could never eat meat again, who saw visions of the faces they had devoured. The Catholic Church had to deal with an enormous theological problem. They had sent these men on a holy war. Now, did they have to forgive them for cannibalism? What some priests said eating pagan enemies in extreme circumstances was forgivable. Eating fellow Christians was not. But no one wanted to investigate too deeply. The complete truth would have destroyed the legitimacy of the entire crusade. And here's the final, truly disturbing detail. It worked. The terror the Tafirs inspired was real. Later, Muslim armies hesitated before besieging crusaders, knowing what they were capable of doing. Cities surrendered more quickly at the threat of a prolonged siege. Cannibalism, as horrible as it was, became an effective psychological weapon. And that's perhaps the darkest thing of all, that absolute atrocity can have tactical value. The Crusaders reached Jerusalem in July 1099, took it after a 5-week siege, and massacred tens of thousands in the streets. But by then, after what they had done at Antioch and Ma'ara, what was one more massacre? They had stopped being soldiers of Christ. They had become something darker, more primitive. Men who had eaten human flesh aren't easily horrified by blood. The official history of the Crusades, the one taught in books, focuses on epic battles, noble knights, unwavering faith. But the truth of the siege of Antioch reveals something we'd prefer not to see. When you push humans far enough, when you starve them, when you terrorize them, when you give them divine justification for violence, they're capable of anything. You don't need demons to create hell on earth. You just need hungry men with God on their side. So the next time someone romanticizes the Crusades, remind them of Antioch. Remind them that the Christian heroes who reclaimed the Holy Land also boiled their enemies in pots and roasted children on spits, and that they documented it themselves, because they wanted everyone to know exactly how far they were willing to go. If you want more medieval history that doesn't hold back on the dark truth, subscribe for weekly videos that dive deep into the stories they don't teach in school. Now, watch this next video where we explore another medieval horror that changed warfare forever.